Welcome. This is a talk on Bootiful Development with Spring Boot and React. You'll notice that little sunset emoji. I don't think that does it justice. This. Come on. I changed the slide. It's coming. I got a better picture. I'm trying to show you a better picture. Go back, go forward. No? It's going to be tough to do it without slides. Well, anyway. So we have ourselves in a unique situation today because my flight leaves 70 minutes after the end of this talk. So it's going to be a tight connection. So the reason I'm warning you now is because if you have questions, I'm not going to be available at the end. So ask them during the presentation, because as soon as it's over, I'm grabbing my stuff, I'm heading for the door. So if you want to walk me out or something like that, maybe we can have questions then. But this is Bootiful and beautiful at the same time. So today I'm going to show you how to develop a Spring Boot API. How many people already know how to develop a Spring Boot API, an API with Spring Boot? Okay, it's about half the room. And then I'll show you how to create a React UI for it. But first, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Matt Raible. I grew up in the backwoods of Montana with no electricity and no running water. And I had to walk 2 miles to the bus stop every day. And it seemed like it was uphill both ways for sure. We used to actually have to go in my parents' bedroom, and here's a picture of it on the right there, and warm up the actual cabin so we could use our Commodore 64 and play Donkey Kong. So I've always been around computers. It was just a weird way to get introduced to computers. I was born in one corner of the cabin, and my sister was born in the other one. I live in Denver, Colorado with my beautiful wife, Trish, and awesome kids, Abby and Jack, and I also have a middle child, which is known as a 1966 Volkswagen bus that I spent 10 years restoring, and it's finally been done in the last year. And so if you have a similar expensive obsession with Volkswagens like I do, I'd love to talk to you, probably not afterwards because of my flight, but send me an email, I'd love to chat. I work for a company called Okta, and basically we do user management in the cloud. 7,000 free active users a month if you want, and we just announced today that we're giving away free accounts for small businesses for a year. So that's kind of different from our developer account. I don't know if you're familiar with Okta, like single sign-on, but that's like their main flagship product, and then we provide OAuth and things like that. But the thing that's really cool is they actually have a pub in their San Francisco office. So I'm a remote worker. I work in Denver. Whenever I come to the office in San Francisco, I work at the pub, which is kind of fun. So we support a number of authentication standards such as OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, and SAML. So now I'd like to learn a little bit more about you. I asked about Spring Boot. I got about half the room. How many people prefer to do their server-side development in Groovy? I got 2 guys in the back. How many Kotlin fans? 1. Java? Everyone else? All right. Anyone developing with Angular? Okay, we got about 5, maybe 10. Anyone doing React development? Okay, we got about 20, so that's positive. And anyone using Vue.js? Just 1 guy, sorry. Anyone doing TypeScript? Keep your hand up if you like it. Well, usually they stay up, but we had a couple go down. Okay, so this presentation was inspired by a blog post I wrote last week and actually published this morning. So if you'd rather go to another talk, I'm sure there's much better ones than this one. Please just leave the room and grab that URL, and then you can click on that and you can do everything that we're going to do today. But basically, it shows how to do the same stuff. But traditionally, what I've seen with Java developers is they often take their web framework, especially when it's JavaScript, like Angular or React, and bundle it into their application. And then they upload a jar or upload a war or whatever, and that's how they do deployment. What I'm going to show you today is how the rest of the world does it. And that is basically they deploy the API separately from the client, and they live on 2 separate servers. Maybe the client lives on a CDN or something like that, and then they do cross-origin request to the server, and that's traditionally how more people are developing. So we'll talk about why Spring Boot. I'll go through that quickly since a lot of you have already used it. I'll do a quick demo with it, and then we'll talk about ES6 versus TypeScript. We'll also talk about why React is really kind of taking the world by storm, and then I'll do a demo with React, and then introduction to progressive web apps and JHipster. So I do have a number of prizes to give out, and this doesn't work. I was just in Belgium and Morocco, And I tried this, and no one actually asked questions during the presentation. So today, if you don't ask questions, you're going to have the same thing where I put a bunch of prizes up here, and then at the end, it's a mob scene. So let's not do that. I have books that are OAuth 2.0 simplified. It's like a $40 book. I got like 5 of those. And then I got some Okta t-shirts here, too. So if you have questions, raise your hand, and I'll call on you, and then you'll get an answer, and you'll get a free prize. So Spring Boot, basically, I like to say it's the on-off switch of enterprise Java. It makes it so easy to do Java these days that it's really living up to what Oracle wants to do, and that is make Java the first development language for people. And they kind of took on Ruby on Rails back in the day and did a pretty good job of really simplifying things. So it automatically configures Spring whenever possible. It provides production-ready features with actuators, such as metrics and health checks. No code generation, no requirement for XML. And it was somewhat revolutionary in that it embeds Tomcat, Jetty, or Undertow. Now, it wasn't the first one to do this. DropWizard did it first, but it really kind of changed a lot of ways that people are doing Java development. So getting started with Spring Boot is very easy. Start.spring.io, Spring INITIALIZR. You can actually download this project and install it at your company yourself if you want to actually tweak the options that start.spring.io has, and you can have your own instance. And so everyone is using it. I like to say the sales of Spring Boot have skyrocketed. You can see compared to the rest of Java frameworks, Netty, Spark Java, Vertex, and DropWizard, just doesn't quite have the tremendous growth that Spring Boot has. And you can write a Spring Boot API in just a few lines of code. If it wasn't for Java and our getters and setters, this would be a full API. But I commented out the getters and setters and toString and hash code and all that, so it actually fits on a slide. But you can also create a microservices architecture with Spring Boot. So this is very exciting in the sense that you can have Netflix and a Eureka service and do auto configuration with that. And you can also have service discovery with Eureka and circuit breakers with Hystrix and intelligent routing with Zool and client-side load balancing with Ribbon. So it's very easy to develop this type of architecture as well. And if you see, there's a link on the bottom there that you can actually go to and read about how to build that. And so all these slides I will publish at the end on Speaker Deck. And so you will be able to download the PDF, and any links that are in here you'll be able to click on and go from there. So now we'll build a Spring Boot API. And one of the things I do want to warn you is I forget from time to time that I didn't unmirror my monitor. Right? So I might be talking and you aren't seeing anything. Someone shout at me or tell me, hey, you're doing it wrong, because I do make that mistake. So I'm just going to make sure I mirror here. Okay, and then we'll see if we can make that a little bit bigger. Okay. So you can obviously go to start.spring.io. It's one way to do it. But Spring INITIALIZR is also an API, so you don't have to do it that way. You can actually type in a command. So I have an alias here. Call it Bootiful. And you can see I make an HTTP request to starter.zip, and then I include those dependencies. So I can do that real quick. And we'll see how the Wi-Fi is, how this works. You can see it downloaded a demo.zip there, so I have that. I can open that. And then in this directory, I'm going to create, we'll call it Spring Boot React example. And we'll go ahead and copy the demo into there. And I like to call it server. Just client server makes sense to me. And then we'll go into Spring Boot React server and then open that in IntelliJ. How many people like IntelliJ? Most of the room. What about Eclipse? There's a few of you. All right. We got 5. The reason that I really like IntelliJ over Eclipse, and it's been a while since I used Eclipse, probably it was my first love of an IDE, but it's probably been 10 years. And the reason for that is because I moved from doing a lot of server-side Java to doing more UI development and JavaScript. And CSS and JavaScript, IntelliJ just does a really good job with handling those languages. And so I do believe Eclipse has similar plugins that work well, but it's been a while since I tried them. So the indexing, though, in IntelliJ kind of makes me mad, especially when I'm doing demos. So we're going to start just by creating an entity. And we'll call it beer. because I like beer. You'll notice one of the things that start.spring.io does is it disagrees with everyone else. It likes tabs. I like spaces. So we have an entity, and then we need a repository for it. So we have an extends JPA repository. Import it. And now we can have something that populates it. So this command line runner takes in that repository, and then we'll print out all the ones in there, but we don't have any in there, so we have to add some. So this is a list of beers that I got from beeradvocate.com. The reason I like to do this, sometimes I do a talk with Josh Long where we let the audience pick the beers, but one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to take these beer names, I'm going to send them off to Giphy, and I'm going to animate a GIF that matches that beer name. So sometimes when you get audience participation, you get some funny names, and you get some risque Giphy images. So I like to have the canned ones, and then I know they're going to work, and I won't be embarrassed up here. So if we have that, we're going to basically, we can run this, and it'll go ahead and insert a bunch of beers and print them out. So you can do that up here with this handy little play button. Takes a little bit to compile. Good time for questions. No? Yeah?
You were typing boot dash and it came up to autocomplete with those live templates?
Yep. So it's a feature of IntelliJ where you can have live templates, you can record them, and you can also put parameters in them. So I could be doing something where instead of beer, we're talking about cars or something like that, and I would just type in car instead of beer. So it's a pretty handy feature. So it looks like I probably have something running already. So we'll go here and go kill all Java. It's one of my favorite commands as well. And I'll go back and start it up again. Okay, so you can see it printed them out, right? Kentucky Brunch Brand Style, Good Morning, Very Hazy, all those. So now what I want to create is a good beer service that filters out like PBR and Coors Light. So boot controller, we'll call it beer controller. And then you see it gets that in again, and we'll go ahead and say, so this basically takes all of them, streams them, filters if they're great or not, and then takes out the ones that aren't. So we can restart. And then we could hit the API using, this is HTTP IE. So you can do 8080, and we can do good beers. And it'll list the ones that we have there. You can also go in here, pretty cool feature, Spring Data JPA, and you can say REST or repository REST resource, and then restart, and it actually takes that entity name beer and makes a bunch of APIs for that. So there's /beers, there's you can post to it, you can add new ones, you can delete them. It all works pretty well. So you can just do HTTP for just beers, and it shows them all. But it also shows them in a way that your client might not like them, right? It's got all these weird kind of URLs in there instead of IDs, and even though this is HotOS and it works well, the client and React, works a little better if we just have a list of names. So I forgot to ask, did you want a book or a t-shirt? Book. Okay. I'll put it here and you can grab it at your convenience. Okay. So that's our API. That works pretty well. Go back to the demo. Let me unmirror here. So ES6, ES7, and TypeScript, some people have confusion about what is what, so I wanted to go over these for a minute first. ES4 was released in 1999. How many people were web developers in 1999? I got a few of you. I've been doing it since like 94. I was doing it before Netscape 1.0 even came out. I've been doing the curly brackets and the angle brackets for a long time. So when IE6 came out in 1999, it was pretty sweet because it was much better than what we were dealing with. But then there was a stagnation where no one really did much in the browser space because Microsoft didn't update IE. And then ES5 wasn't released until 2009. So then when Chrome came out and when Firefox came out, they kind of pushed the web forward, and that's why ES5 came along, and we had a lot of success with jQuery and building websites that way. ES6 is a little bit different. It has classes and modules. It's also known as ECMAScript 2015. And it looks a lot more like Java than JavaScript before it, because before it you had to use like prototypes and stuff like that, and now you can have actual classes. And ES7 is technically ECMAScript 2016. It was finalized last June 2016. And the only features it really has are exponential operators, which is star and array prototype includes. They had a notion of decorators in there, which they look like our annotations, but they actually don't exist in ES6 or ES7. They actually removed it out. So using TypeScript, you can actually have that decorator pattern or that annotation. And so we'll see that today. So all browsers have good support for ES5. This is caniuse.com. You can use this site to find out which browsers support what. Also has, not just desktop, but mobile as well. And you can see ES6, IE11 is not going to get it because they're not doing actual maintenance on that anymore, so it will never have it. And Opera Mini, I don't know who really uses that. So there's plenty of browsers that support ES6 well. And the class support is almost at 75%, and the modules are 5%. So there's another feature of ES6 called modules, which doesn't have that much support. But TypeScript kind of solves that problem, and you don't have to worry about your browser, whether it supports ES6, ES5. You can actually use TypeScript and then transpile it to JavaScript and set what level of support you want there. So it basically has optional static typing. So everything you can do in ES6 plus static typing. So a lot of the code that you'll see today is really ES6 with some TypeScript niceties on top of it. So JavaScript already has types like number and string and Boolean. TypeScript adds additional ones like a tuple or an enum. Also has any and void types. And it's also got interfaces and generics that you can use with TypeScript. So the big advantage of that is tooling. You can use tools like IntelliJ or like VS Code or even Eclipse to actually get really good feedback. You know this from being Java developers, and code completion while you're developing. And you can also run TypeScript compiler on an existing JavaScript, so you can actually find out when errors exist there. Yes. Yep. Right. Right, but there's actually something that happened recently. I think it was with IE10 or IE11. It's coming to the point where it's actually going to be against the law to use IE because of security reasons, right? I mean, they have Microsoft Edge, right? But yes, it happens with Angular and React both that it works great when you're doing Chrome and Firefox, and then you try it on IE, and you're like, oh, man. Right. So, so it might happen, but there is build tools like Webpack that you can have polyfills, they call them, that add that behavior so it'll work in IE11. And there's a ton of IE11 users out there, so I don't see a problem with using TypeScript in IE11. Shirt or book? Book? OK. I'm not going to throw it at you because that'll be tough, but I'll leave it up here. So this is what a class looks like. It's more about just, on the last slide I showed you, you can have a regular function just like in normal JavaScript. And you can see that greeter function has a person of type string, right? So that's definitely different from normal JavaScript. And then the rest of it looks like regular JavaScript, and then you can compile it using the TSC command. And so here's a class, bus, with a name. And you can see the getters and setters are different from Java. This actually is standard syntax for ES6, where you can say bus.name equals, and that calls the setter. You do bus.name just to retrieve the value and read it, and that calls the getter. As far as the constructor is concerned, that little question mark and colon is what they call an Elvis operator. It's basically allowing that to be null. So instead of having constructors where you have multiple constructors, you just have optional parameters in the constructor. And actually with TypeScript, you don't even need those first 5 lines of code. Or you don't need the private name. You do need the constructor, but it'll set the constructor for you. So that's one of the things you'll see in the examples, especially with Angular, not so much with React. And then at the bottom there, you can see it's got string interpolation in there, as long as you use the backticks, and then you can put variables inline. And TypeScript 2.3, I don't know, this might be tough to see, but in VS Code, you can actually just put a comment at the top that's @ts-check, and it'll tell you on a regular JavaScript file where you're missing imports and where you haven't done your checking of your your variables properly and where maybe they aren't initialized and stuff like that. So it has those features built in. So even if you aren't using TypeScript, you can still use its type checking to make things better. But before you can write any code in TypeScript, you actually have to use Node. And so a lot of people, when they think of Node, they think of it as something that you run server applications with. But in the web world and the UI world of development, it's much more than that. It's used a lot for just building, right? And for installing various components like CSS frameworks and Webpack. And basically, it makes your code work in older browsers. So Node.js is the best way to download Node. And then there's this thing called MVM. You'll see it on the bottom there. That's a great tool for switching between Node versions and works really nicely that way. So in my opinion, the leading JavaScript frameworks this year are Angular, React, and Vue.js. Those have emerged as the leaders. And this is based on traffic patterns that we've seen both at Stormpath and at Okta and on Scotch.io when we've had articles there and just sharing information with them. And it's also based on a gut feel I have. And so usually my gut feelings are right. When I talked about Java web frameworks back in the day, I always said Spring MVC was pretty good, and look, it kind of won that battle. But this other guy, Eric Elliott, also said the same thing last December. He said, the top JavaScript frameworks and topics to learn in 2017 are React, Redux, Angular, and RxJS. And the thing I really like about being a front-end developer is you can actually grab Medium posts that are squished and stretch them out so they fit on a slide. So that's the advantage of Chrome developer tools. And the quote from this that I think is very important is Angular and React dominate, and nothing else even comes close. So Angular and React dominate more than any of our Java web frameworks ever dominated. Tons of people are using them, and it's providing significant advantages. So here, even more so, it says more people are interested in learning React than Angular, and React significantly leads Angular in user satisfaction. So how many people in the audience have used both Angular and React? And keep your hands up if you prefer React. Notice that? They all stayed up. So it's one of those things that it's fun to code in Angular, and it works pretty well. But when you code in React, there's this thing that happens where you almost have an epiphany after a couple of days of working with it, where you're like, oh, this is actually pretty cool how it works. So hopefully you'll get some of that today when we're doing some live coding. But I also like to show numbers. It's always fun to have graphs in your presentation. Yes, you had a question?
The learning curve is much steeper for React.
Are you asking if it is steeper for React than Angular?
I heard.
Well, here's the difference. I think for me personally, as a Java developer, before I got into Angular, AngularJS made a lot of sense because they had controllers and services and stuff like that. So it was very easy for me to adapt to that. And then Angular came along and made it a little different. But React is just a different way of thinking. And I actually have a video in here. I'm not going to show the video. I'm just going to show you a link to it that basically teaches you React in an hour. And so you can learn everything that you need to know about React. And I'll attempt to do the same thing, but this has got some Spring Boot in there, so I don't know if it will. But would you like a book or a T-shirt? All right, I'll leave them up here. So there's this site called hotframeworks.com. I didn't even know it existed until 2 weeks ago. And it combines the GitHub score and the Stack Overflow score. So I assume it's how many questions are on Stack Overflow and how many are on GitHub. It's kind of tough to read there. The actual leading one is AngularJS. Or actually, no, ASP.NET is the #1 hot framework according to this. And then AngularJS is up there, and then it's Ruby on Rails. But anyway, the hard thing to see is there's a pink line in the very middle there. That's React. That's really transcending the most, the quickest. But I also like to look at jobs. So this is on Indeed.com in the US. You can see that React is catching up to how many people are hiring for Angular. And I think Angular has the advantage of they changed the name, they changed the framework, but they just shortened the name. So AngularJS could show up here as well. But you'll see Vue and Polymer, really not a lot of people hiring for that right now. Stack Overflow tags, a lot of people have problems with Angular. That's why they're asking questions, maybe? I don't know. But they have had one of the biggest growth that's happened. So there's an article that I'll point to later. This is also jQuery and AngularJS. You can see that they certainly peaked on Stack Overflow about 2013, 2014. And Angular and React have been on the rise. GitHub Stars. This is where I think it gets interesting because you'll notice that React and Vue have the most GitHub Stars. And they pretty much dwarf Angular. And if you look at an older one like Backbone, Backbone has stars that really doesn't go up and down much. It kind of stays the same. Those are developers, right? No one really stars a project on GitHub unless they have an account, and only developers really create accounts. So I think it says a lot for both of those frameworks that, hey, React and Vue, we like them, we're starring them, we're watching the projects. And if you look at star growth between Angular, Vue, and React, you'll see that Vue is actually climbing, but React still has a lead for the most stars. So to do Hello World with React, it's very easy, very different from Angular. So Angular 4, Angular 5, the way you create Hello World with that is actually like 5 or 6 different files, right? So it's kind of a pain to just create Hello World because you have to bootstrap a number of different things. Well, with React, it's much easier. You just have a root element, you give it an ID, and then you React DOM render. And so the biggest problem that people have with React when they first start using it is, what is HTML doing in my JavaScript? And so that was one of the biggest controversies that it had when it first came out. But I hope to show you why that actually works really well and it's very fast. So with imperative code, this is the way we used to do things with jQuery. This is from an example in the video I'll show you later that basically says, hey, if you have more than 99 notifications on Facebook, that little icon, that your notification icon, turns to fire. I didn't know that. Has anyone had more than 99 notifications? Right, so hidden feature, didn't know about it. But basically, the old way of doing it with jQuery, you would have to manage your transitions in state. You'd have to do different things based on the count. You remove the badge, you add the badge, you remove fire, you has fire. And it's very verbose and kind of tough to do. And it describes how to change the UI. And declarative code defines the UI you want. So declarative is the way that React does it. And basically, React diffs the HTML so it looks much easier. So the React way of doing it is you return the divs themselves. And so this is a lot easier than manipulating state in the page. And the beauty of this is it does similar to what Git does, where Git just has a diff of what you changed, and it sends that to the server. This is the same thing. So if you rendered that class name Bell when the count was 0, and then the count was greater than 99, it doesn't even re-render those class name Bell again. It just renders that span inside the Bell. So it's smart enough to know what changed and only return that part. So it also allows imperative style, but more people are doing it this way where it's much more concise. So create React app makes it super easy to get started with creating a new app. You can just npm install it, and then you run create React app, cd into it, npm start. If you want to do TypeScript, you actually specify a script's version parameter when you create your app, and then it'll use TypeScript. So one of the things that I'm going to do today is use TypeScript in my demo because I like TypeScript. And also, there isn't a lot of React documentation out there for people doing it. So I think it's important to show that, hey, it's possible, and it's not too difficult. So this is what it looks like when you create a new app, and then it actually prints out a whole bunch of information for you and says, hey, these are the commands you might want to use to do tests, to build it, or to eject what they call your Webpack configuration. So you have a bunch of new JavaScript to maintain if you want, or you can just leave it in there like it is. The thing that I really like is developers. How many people read documentation? We got 3 people, 4 people. Not many people read documentation, right? But if there's a README, you might actually read the documentation. So create React app creates this README file that's got all of the basic knowledge that you need about React in the actual project. So that's kind of cool. You don't see it unless you check it into GitHub, but you can also open it up locally and see it. So this is the video I was talking about from Eric Vicente. And it's an intro to React. It was done earlier this year. And the thing I really like about it is he has a GitHub repository that he demos, and you can follow along and copy and paste code just like he does and actually develop the app at the same time. So that's a pretty neat thing. It's on Vimeo there, and he's got a GitHub project associated with it as well. And if you look at the developer blog at Okta, I also include a link. So one of the things that's really hot these days is progressive web apps. So progressive web apps allow you to actually install an app in your browser or on your desktop or on a phone. It would be on your home screen. And so the advantage of that versus just having like the Apple icon or whatever that you set to a site is they can actually work offline. So the 3 requirements for a progressive web app has to come from HTTPS, it has to load while offline, and it has to have a web app manifest that actually gives details about what it looks like when you install it. It has like a name, an icon, and a start page and stuff like that. So if you're developing web apps, these are 2 ways to develop them. Yes?
Do you know if you can do like push notifications with PWA on a phone?
Push notifications? So the question was, can you do push notifications on a phone with a PWA? And the answer is yes. So they do have that capability of doing push notifications. It's kind of like your browser though, right? You have to accept that you'll take notifications from there and then they'll do that. So it's basically a way that you can write web apps for the phone and you don't have to actually package it up with Cordova or anything. So responsive web design, how many people are doing that? How many people are doing mobile first? Okay, so we got like half the room on the first one, we got like 5 or 6 people on the second one. The difference is with responsive, you make it look good on your big old monitor, and then you make it look good on your little monitor, and even though you have like 5 megabytes of HTML and JavaScript, it works well on the phone, right? It looks well. It might not render well or perform well, but it looks good. Mobile first is where you do the opposite. You start testing on the phone, maybe use Chrome's device toolbar and actually set it to iPhone 6, and then you scale it up. And I like the second one better because what I find is product managers typically will put less in the app if it starts on a phone. And then when it blows up, it can add more features or whatever, but it's difficult to do versus the top way of doing it. So the reason I say that is because this is a quote from Alex Russell at Chrome Developer Summit in October 2016. And he basically says we've failed on mobile because 3 seconds on a 3G connection is what's realistic. And there was a DoubleClick report, also owned by Google, that 53% of visits are abandoned if a mobile site takes more than 3 seconds to load. And that same report said the average mobile site loads in 19 seconds. Right? That's terrible. We don't see it here, right? I don't see it in Denver. I don't see it in San Francisco so much. I was over in Morocco 2 weeks ago, and you see it, right? And in Belgium too. I have a T-Mobile phone, and they throttle my connection to 2G once I'm overseas, and basically most of the web is unusable just because it's so slow, right? The apps kind of work, but the web isn't. And so we failed on mobile because your laptop, your lovely, faithful laptop, is a filthy liar, right? It's telling you the wrong information. It's telling you that, hey, the network is fast, things load fast, when they really don't. So the best way to fight back is to implement the purple pattern. Get a slow phone. Get a $200 unlocked Android device. Use Chrome's developer tools. Use Lighthouse. Lighthouse is a tool to test the performance and the PWA-ness of your application. And then use the DevTools network and CPU throttling. So the purple pattern is push critical resources for the initial URL route. So that's there right away. Render the initial route. Pre-cache the remaining routes. And then lazy load and create remaining routes on demand. So I'll show you the first few things. We won't really get into the lazy loading. But if you want to learn more about PWAs, I wrote a blog post about that as well. So now we'll get into building a React client. So close that one. Close that one. So this is where it gets tricky because, see, someone has to tell me, right? Because we're doing npm install on stage on conference Wi-Fi. And that's always a little risky. So we'll see how it goes. So I'm in here and create React app. And we'll call it client. And I got some notes here. So that you got to do scripts version equals React script TS. So that creates a new React app in that client directory. It says installing packages might take a couple minutes. Usually, this is under a minute. Could be a couple, we'll see. Any questions while this creates? Yes?
Why use TypeScript instead of Flow, for instance?
So Flow is from Facebook. The question was why I use TypeScript instead of Flow. And it's very similar in the sense of it's adding types to the language. And I think if I was more of a pure React developer, I might be using Flow. But I actually did Angular for the last 5 years, and so I became very familiar with TypeScript and comfortable there. And also on the JHipster project, we've decided to use TypeScript because we're doing a lot with Angular as well. So it's just my background. I'm sure Flow works just fine as well, and a lot of people are successful with that. It's kind of like Mocha versus Jest, right? There's different testing frameworks as well. What typically happens and what we've kind of seen in the community around React is if Facebook creates it, the React community is like, works for me. And so they've been very successful at producing packages and people just using them without that much discrimination. Yes?
So we are deciding between Angular and React, and one of the key factors is being able to test it. Now, which of the two frameworks favors testing it?
So the question was, he's trying to decide between React and Angular, which makes easier to test with. The good news is both of them have testing frameworks built in. And with Jasmine, I've done a lot of testing with Angular. Works really well. With React, you can use Jasmine as well, but they also have Jest, which is J-E-S-T. It's from Facebook, and it's what they use to test just because it does like parallel testing. And so it can be faster on their big component models and stuff like that. So they both have first-class support for testing, so you don't really have to worry about that much. And then as far as driving the browser, you can use Protractor to do a lot of that and actually have integration and E2E tests. Okay, so 2 minutes, 8 seconds, not too bad. You can see it tells us to cd into the client and run yarn start. So Yarn is similar to NPM. Yarn was created by Facebook as an alternative to NPM. The reason they did it is because NPM for the longest time didn't do caching. So you know how Maven downloads the internet? Like NPM downloads the internet and all its friends. Like it's huge. And if I was to run, count lines of code on a node modules directory, it might be in the millions of lines of code. So this is what it looks like when you get started. It just says, hey, edit that file and you'll be good to go. So we'll close this and we'll open it up in IntelliJ. New window. We'll leave our server running there. So the first thing we'll do is this is the main React component. We'll go ahead and add a component did mount. This is one of the lifecycle methods you can use. Component did mount. And then in there, we'll just go ahead and set a state. State is how you basically transfer information, and the state stays within a component. So we'll set the state to just is loading is true. And then we'll go ahead and say fetch. Fetch is an API that's an alternative to XHR, and so it's available in most browsers. If you use can I use, you'll see it's available. So we can say here, we'll go to that, HTTP localhost 8080 good beers. Then we'll say then response. And the hardest part about doing Java and TypeScript is fat arrow versus thin arrow. Right? In Java, you got the thin arrow. In TypeScript, you got the fat arrow. So that's kind of tough to remember. But then you can take it from there and do data, this set state, and we'll go ahead and set beers to be data is loading to false. And you have to do semicolons when you're doing TypeScript. And then as far as the constructor, that's where you want to put everything. So we got a constructor. We'll call it props. We pass in props. That's the default argument. And then any. And then right here we do super. And then we set the default state. So this state, set it to beers is just an empty array. And then is loading is obviously false. Okay, so we're starting to get somewhere. Clean things up a bit. And then we'll basically want to import that state. So you can set a couple of const variables. We'll say beers and is loading. And we'll set that to this state. Grab it from there. And then you can basically say if is loading, you'll just return, right? Return a paragraph that says loading like that. Then my notes here. And then you just basically take that beer, right? We can get rid of this get starting here, and you take beers and you say map, and then you can basically pass in the beer as a beer any. All right, and then you need the fat arrow. I always forget that. And you need that guy. And then basically you have to have a key. They require you have a key. So key div key equals, even if there's no beer ID, it still requires that or it fails. And then you can just say beer name. So that should all work. We can do something more like wrap a div around it. And then we can give it like a title so we know it's working. H2 beer list. Okay. Now go back to our browser. Is it working? Oh, we stopped it. So we got to do yarn start again. Oh, MVM use node 8. Yarn start. Is loading. Sure. Okay, so this is one of the weird errors that I like to show people because it's like, what the heck? So app TSX on 25, it's saying, hey, it doesn't understand that, and this actually comes from TypeScript. So if you set that, it fixes it. So it looks like it's loading. And then you look at your console and it says, hey, can't do cross-origination requests, right? That's because we didn't do anything in Spring Boot to allow that. So we go back to Spring Boot and we say, okay, for this good beers, let's go ahead and allow cross-origin. And we'll do origins equals, and we'll do HTTP localhost 3000. But I'm also going to do 5000 because that's another port that you can run it on when you do a prod build. So 5000. Then we'll restart that. Now if we go back to our browser, refresh, now we're getting somewhere, right? We got those beer lists coming back for our service so we can see them, but we want the Giphy images, right, to show those as well. So that requires a little more work. We can go back to our client. So one of the problems we have right now is everything's in this main component. And we actually, the way to do React development is you have everything in its own component. So we can actually take this app and put it in a beer list component. And then we'll just change app to beer list. Place it there. Skip that one, and then replace it there as well. And so in here, it's pretty much the same thing we had before. We don't need all this wrapper stuff. We can just return the beer list itself. Okay, and then back in our app, we can essentially delete the constructor now. We can delete component did mount, and we can even take out this stuff. And right here, we can change this to beer list. Pretty cool, right? So a lot cleaner, and you'll see it imports beer list from beer list up here. It says, hey, you're not using the logo in here, so go in there and delete it. Now if we go back to our browser, it still all works, right? Same as before, but our code's a little cleaner now. So we can also create a Giphy image component. TSX. And so this guy, you'll see it extends React component. It also, one of the things you can do is you can have interfaces, right, for both the props and for the state to pass in. So this initializes a Giphy URL to nothing. And then on component did mount, it calls the Giphy API. This is one of the most important things you can do in this call is limit equals 1. Because if you don't have that limit in there, Giphy's API gives you 25 back. And we're only going to grab the first one, so that's, you know, poor performance if we do it otherwise. So we use fetch again. We pass in the name of the beer, and then we grab the response, and we basically set the state to the first URL from what's returned. And then if there isn't one, then you get a dancing cat image, which is always fun to show, because I like dancing cats. See if it works. Because there might not be any 404s. Might not work very well either. Well, come on. Dancing cat. There we go. Okay, so then basically you do the is loading, you have the URL, and then just return an image. So to actually use that in the beer list, you can go back here and say BR tag and then Giphy image, and you'll see it prompts you because it's smart and using TypeScript. And you can pass in the beer name, and then back to Firefox, and it actually pulls in those images from Giphy, right, for each one. So the other thing I wanted to show you is this actually isn't a progressive web app right off the bat. So if we go into localhost 3000, there's tools within Chrome that you can actually inspect and look at the app. So the manifest tells what information it has in there. You'll see it's got some identity information for actually installing it. You can click on here and add to home screen, and nothing happens because I got to turn on some flags to make that work. And then service workers. Service workers are actually what's used to do the caching of the network requests in the background. And you'll see there's nothing registered here. So to make that work, you can do yarn build. And the cool thing is, you do yarn build and it optimizes everything for production. It puts the service workers in there, so you don't have to deal with like this network caching when you're developing locally. And you'll see it prints out and says, hey, you know, here's how to actually render it. So you can install this yarn serve, and then you can do serve-s and build, and you can actually serve that directory. So now it even copies it to your clipboard for you, and you can go back here and say port 5000. Just paste it right in there, and everything is still working, right? And then you can come back here and refresh it or go to 5000, and you'll see the service worker's been registered there. And so there's other information, right? Your manifest has that, and you can also clear the storage. So one of the problems with doing progressive web apps is for the longest time we've developing web apps that actually work, you know, and we're trying not to cache things, right? And so single page applications broke the bat button. Progressive web apps break the refresh button, right? And so you have to be careful of that. You don't want to cache too aggressively, but I do want to show you a bit more about them. So there's this tool called Lighthouse, which I've installed, and you can actually run it on your application to see how you're scoring on a PWA scale. So it takes a little while to run. It actually does CPU throttling and network throttling as part of this. So it tries to see, hey, how will this perform on a 3G connection, and how will it perform if you have a slower CPU. So it tries to make your laptop so it's not a filthy liar, which is nice. Well, it's a Chrome plugin, and it's available online, and now it's part of Chrome developer tools as well. So there's an audit tab that will show you the Lighthouse report. The reason I do it this way is because it blows it up bigger and uses the whole browser. If you do the audit in the Chrome developer tools, then it's stuck in that little window. So it's actually built into Chrome now, yeah. Yep. So Lighthouse has command line utilities as well as Chrome plugins and stuff. So works pretty well. You can see here, progressive web app. We're getting 3 failed audits. The biggest one is HTTPS. Right? We're not on HTTPS, and then it's not configured for a custom splash screen. So here it says, hey, you don't have any icons that are at least 512 pixels. So we can go, and I downloaded one beforehand. So I have this beer icon here, and I can go into public, and that's where the manifest is. So you'll see this manifest. We probably want to change it to be something like beers, and name to be good beers. And then we can actually take and add another icon. This one we'll just do beer, PNG, 512 by 512. And we'll get a much better score now, right? Because we have this one. But really, we want an even better score. We want to, have HTTPS. And you know how much of a pain it is to install a local certificate with, SSL. So I think it's easier just to deploy to Cloud Foundry. We could also do Heroku. I have scripts for both. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to say touch Cloud Foundry.sh. And I'll open that up. And so this script, what it does is it basically has a few methods for logging in and for getting the app domain. And then it creates or it deletes the apps in case I forgot to delete them before the demo. So it's going to have a React client and a Goodbeer server. It deploys the server by going into that directory, running clean package, and then pushing the jar. And you'll notice it uses random route, so it's going to have random URL for the back end and the front end. And so because of that, we get the URL for the server. And then in the client, we go and change that, right? From localhost 8080, just using sed in that beer list. And then we yarn build it. And then one of the features that you can do on Cloud Foundry is have push state enabled. So it always goes back to your single page, the beginning. And then it starts that and forces HTTPS to true. And then it grabs that URL for the client and goes and changes the server as well, right? Because we had that core setting where it said only allow localhost 3000 and 5000. And then it redeploys the server and cleans some things up. So see if that works. And then we should be able to get a much better Lighthouse score because we are on HTTPS, right? And I don't know, this might take a while, so I'll kind of push that in the background. We have, it's not going to work at all. Well, I've done it in the past. It gets like 100%, right? It gets a PWA score of 100. It looks like here it's just, internet's not too dependable. I can try it again, but tough to do on conference Wi-Fi. But I do want to show you some other things. So on the server, one of the things that we have at Okta is a Spring Boot starter for doing security. Yes? What's that? No, not yet. Right? So the question is Reacts and Redux, and when would you introduce Redux? The interesting thing, there's articles out there that say do not use Redux until you have to. Because basically it's one of those things that is a little bit complicated. And if I was to use Redux in this, you guys would be like, why didn't he just use fetch? Right, it's so much simpler. So I will show you an example with JHipster. JHipster has React support, and we use Redux in there. And so that might be a place to look at how we're doing it there. But in a demo like this, I just think it complicates too much. So the general idea is, try to stay away from it until you really need it, and then go ahead and learn it, and you'll probably be happy with it. So back to the server. I'm just going to show you a quick demo on how to add security. We have a Spring Boot starter at Okta that integrates with Spring Security. So we can do Maven. Okta Maven Boot, so Okta Spring Boot Starter 0.2.0. And then we also have to, Spring Security OAuth ships with an older version. So Spring OAuth 2, we just set that to 2.2.0. Then we enable auto import, and again, spaces. Oh, and there's some properties. So in application.properties, what did I set it to? So you have to specify the issuer and the client ID. So on Okta, I went and created an OpenID Connect app and gave me a client ID from that. Stop that, restart it. And so this locks down the backend. And now what the backend expects, there's one more thing. I have to do enable resource server here. What that does is it says, hey, to talk to any of these APIs, you actually have to have a bearer token, right? So you have to get a token from the client, send that to the server with the request in order to talk to it and do security that way. I don't know why it's not starting. It shouldn't need an internet connection. Oh, probably because it's trying to download. Well, we can just write code, right? I won't demo it, but I can show you what it looks like. So then in here, you'll basically do, yeah, it's not going to work because we got to add stuff. So in client, you do yarn add Okta React, and then you'll also need React router DOM. So you install those two, you configure a few things. You basically end up with a login button that goes and redirects to Okta for login, comes back, then you have a bearer token that you can use. And I think I have the code in here that I can show you how it looks. Looks just a little different. So where is it? So you can see the component did mount. We go ahead and add the authorization header as an actual bearer token. And then this uses async and await, so you don't have to do the dot then. So you can use those with React as well. Makes it more like a synchronous call. And so it adds that, and then it goes and populates it. So because the internet's not working so well, I can't really show that. So if you want to do more authentication with React, not only is the post that I talked about earlier showing our Okta React SDK, but there's also a sign-in widget. So if you don't want to redirect and you just want to embed like a login widget in your page, this is a post that shows you how to do that. But I also wanted to talk about JHipster a bit. So JHipster is a Yeoman generator that generates a project that has a Spring Boot backend and an Angular front end. And for the longest time, that's the only way it worked. And we had AngularJS support, and we rose with AngularJS and became very popular. Yeoman is basically a way of generating projects, right? So even though we're generating Java code and we're generating TypeScript, everything is written in what they call EJS templates. And then that parses things and puts different parameters in there. And the funny thing is, the JHipster mascot there has a Spring Boot tattoo and an Angular tattoo. So he's going to have to get reconstructive surgery, or he's going to have to add a React tattoo back here or something like that, because we do have React support now, but it is experimental. So if you accept all the defaults when you create a JHipster project, it'll have React in there, and I'll show you how to do that. But one of the cool things about JHipster is not only does it create like a monolith for you with a Spring Boot backend and an Angular front end, it can create microservices. So it can generate a gateway. It has a JHipster registry, which is just Spring Cloud's Eureka service, but we added a nicer UI on it. And then it also can generate microservices in the back end. And it can generate CRUD for all those. So if you have an entity that's a blog and it has a title and content and a date, you can generate all the code for that from front to back. And the Spring Boot code is very small because Spring Boot and Spring Data automates a lot of that, where you don't have to have a lot of code. But on the front end, right, you still have to have a lot of code. So it's nice that you can just generate that boilerplate. And so I'll show, let's see here. This looks like it failed, but I can show you kind of how it works in the sense that when you run yo JHipster, you can see I did this 10 minutes before this talk started, -- experimental, that's how you actually get the React support. And so it prompts you, it says, hey, first of all, your internet connection isn't great. But then it says, what type of application would you like to create? So it prompts you if you want a gateway or a microservice. I chose monolithic application in this sense. The base name of your application is SpringOne, default Java package name. Type whatever you want. And then I use authentication, JWT authentication. It also supports session-based authentication, just like traditional with cookies and stuff. And we also have OAuth. So if you want to use Keycloak with JHipster or Okta or anyone that has an OAuth provider, you could use Google or LinkedIn or Twitter. You could certainly do that as well. And it's just Spring security properties. So the cool thing is you can switch between Keycloak and Okta just by changing environment variables and overriding what Spring Boot has. It's got support for MySQL, MariaDB, Postgres. It also supports MongoDB and Cassandra if you want to use those instead, and use Spring's data support for those. Production database, you get to choose between what you want for development, what you want for production. Hibernate second level cache, and then you can see here what framework do you want to use for the client. So that's where React comes in. And then this didn't actually succeed, so I can't run it. Bummer. But it does provide a nice UI and some default stuff that hooks into Spring Actuator. So Spring Boot Actuator has information on the endpoints, on metrics, and things like that, and we provide a nice UI for that. I'll try it again, though, just to see. So if you've already created an application, what happens is there's this yo.rc.json that has all the answers that you had in there. So once you have that, you can actually just run it again. And if there's a good internet, then maybe it'll create it, but probably not. Yeah. So the question is, are we going to upgrade to Spring Security 5 and like Angular 5 and all that? Yes, there's pull requests that are currently in progress. For Angular 5, we're pretty close on that. For Spring Boot, what we found is it's still milestone releases, right? They're on like M7 now, and we'd love to like adopt that and actually be able to go to Java 9. But it's still a milestone release, and we really don't want to push that on our users. We like to only use stable stuff. And so we use like a beta version of Bootstrap, right, CSS, but that has been like stable for 6 months, right? So in the Spring Boot case, we're still kind of waiting for the release. But there is a way that you can try it out, yeah.
You wrote a really nice tutorial about a year ago on using JHipster and kind of walked everybody through a project. Is there any plans to do that again for React?
Yes. Yep. So the question was, I wrote a tutorial on doing basic development with JHipster and Angular. Will I be doing it for React? Most likely, yes, next year, when it's more stable. We still don't have the entity generator working with React, so you can't actually do one of the things that people really like to do with JHipster. So probably need to finish that first. So I liked it so much, I was doing a lot of work with Spring Boot and Angular consulting, and as an independent consultant at the time, I was like, I actually want to market myself better, right? Not only speaking at conferences, but writing books is a great way to do that. So I went and said, hey, JHipster looks pretty cool. I'm going to start using that and writing about it. So in the process of writing the book, I discovered a whole bunch of bugs, right? And eventually became a contributor to the project. So I wrote the JHipster book. It's free from InfoQ. If you want to actually buy a printed version, you can. But you can also download it for free, and it works on Kindle, it works on EPUB. I wrote it all with ASCII Doctor, and it was a great experience. They thought it would be one of the most expensive books that they ever like helped publish, and it turned out to be one of the cheapest because ASCII Doctor allows me to send or produce all the artifacts and just send it to them. They don't have to do any work there. So I wrote a sample app for it called 21 Points, and 21 Points was an app that I wanted for my health because Spring Boot monitors your app's health pretty good. And when I started writing the book, I started doing this sugar detox. So it was my wife's idea, and it was actually her friend's idea, and it was like a 3-week sugar detox. So I find out the first day of the sugar detox that there's no beer. And so I'm like, man, this is going to be a long 3 weeks. But up until then, I've had high blood pressure most of my life. And after the first week, my prescription ran out for blood pressure medication, and I called my doctor, and he's like, you got to come in. And I was like, what a pain in the ass. I'm already pissed off because, you know, I've been doing this detox for a week. I'll just wait until I'm done. And so after 3 weeks, my blood pressure was fine for one of the first times in my life. And so what I discovered is sugar, for me anyway, really has an effect on my blood pressure. So I said, okay, I'm going to write this app that tracks my health. And so I get a point every day. You get 3 points a day, 21 a week. You get a point if you eat well. For me, that's no sugar. You get a point if you drink well or responsibly. So, you know, maybe a glass of wine or something like that, but anything over that, like, you're going to lose a point. And then exercise, right? It's very important, even just walking the dogs or something like that. So I typically try to get like 15, 16 points a week. And I find if I get below 10, I actually get sick. So as a parent of kids, I used to blame them when I got sick, right? They brought the cold home from school. Now I know it's my fault, right? I can actually look and say, hey, my health caused that, not my kids. And I also took that ASCII Doctor framework that I used for the book and made it into this InfoQ mini book project. If you want to write a mini book for InfoQ, they're usually around 80 or 100 pages, and it's a great way to, you know, market yourself and learn something at the same time. So I invite you to try Spring Boot if you aren't already. Try React. Try Okta. We actually have a great program where I can buy developers beer. Developers are like customers for us. So if you're a developer, we happen to be in the same city, I'll take you out for a beer, I can buy you lunch, it's all expensible. So explore PWAs, try those out, and you know, enjoy the Bootiful experience. And the other thing that's happening is Kotlin, right? Kotlin is very popular, especially at this conference and in the local Bay Area. I wrote a tutorial on how to build an application on the back end with Kotlin, and then the front end with Angular and TypeScript. So the reason I like to show this is such a missed opportunity. This was a graphic that one of our designers made, and look at the letters in it. O, K, T, A. Like if he had just switched them around, we could have had like Okta right in there, right? And man, so close. If you want another laugh, go and look up what Katso means on Urban Dictionary. Luckily no one did that and put any comments in. But with Kotlin, you can actually do 13 lines of code and create a whole API. So when I showed the Java API earlier, and I said, hey, we had to take out all the getters and setters. With Kotlin, you don't even need the getters and setters, and you can put like your annotations in the class signature. You can do JSON ignore in there, and whole API right there. So that's pretty neat. Like I said, you can do everything we did today, do it yourself, hopefully with a better internet connection, and it tells you a little bit more about Angular. I think in that second paragraph, it's pretty neat to see that as an Angular developer, I thought Angular had a huge ecosystem with a ton of components that you could use, and they do. They have almost 18,000 packages on npm.js. React has 42,000. So there's a huge ecosystem around React and Angular and Vue.js. And what I would recommend is don't just learn one, like pick up another one and learn that too, just to have a little different mindset. And I write a lot of tutorials on the Okta developer blog, so certainly check that out. And if you have any questions, keep in touch. Hit me up on my website. Hit me up on Twitter. Like I said, I'll upload this presentation to SpeakerDeck. And the code, the sample app for everything is on GitHub. So since it could be a mob scene, right, with T-shirts and books, I'm going to set those out here. There's a few of you that I owe them to, so please, people, don't grab those two. But I do have some time for questions, right? We got like 3 minutes left. So any other questions? Yeah.
Do you ever eject from create React app? That's sort of part of the life cycle of development.
Right. So one of the things is, would you eject and get the Webpack build from create React app? Angular CLI has the same thing, and no, because it's like another 1,000 lines of code that I have to maintain. Well, thanks for coming.